he comes with this treatment. The black man is in whiteface with a white blonde wig, even had some horns.
We just gave him a quick little boom, boom, little pump jump up to get beat down.
That's what I was thinking.
They called themselves Brand Nubian, prophets of knowledge, teachers of black pride. But behind the sermons and the smooth boom bap beats was a group that didn't just talk power, they enforced it.
I know Sadat X got caught with a gun at one point. Number one, what was the reason why Sadat was carrying a gun?
You probably have to ask him.
They had gangs beat up DJs, terrified rappers across coasts, and one member even flashed a loaded gun at a group of teenagers.
But nobody backed out. They didn't have the money, you bozo. The are you talking about?
The irony? These were men preaching peace while fighting their own war for respect.
They didn't have their business right. Nobody back out trying to paint it like you somebody was scared of you. Get the out of here.
Let's talk about the untold story of how Brand Nubian blurred the line between philosophy and fear, and later paid the price. The Bronx in the late 1980s wasn't a place you simply lived. It was a place you survived. The crack epidemic had turned corners into traps, families into stories you didn't tell twice. But in the chaos, a new kind of voice was forming, one that sounded like resistance and looked like pride. This was the world that gave birth to Brand Nubian. Before they were a name on record sleeves, they were just 4 young men trying to make sense of a world that seemed rigged against them. Grand Puba, born Maxwell Dixon, was already something of a neighborhood legend. He'd cut his teeth in the group Masters of Ceremony, a smooth uptown act that blended hip-hop's sharp edges with party vibes. Their 1988 single Sexy had earned regional love, but not much else.
Grand Puba, won't you tell them why? Hey pretty mama, you look sweet. I mean, you're the type of girl that I've been dying to meet.
When the group folded, Puba didn't pause. He knew what he wanted, something raw, something real. In New Rochelle, just 20 minutes from the Bronx but a world apart, he linked up with 2 MCs who shared his hunger, Lord Jamar and Sadat X. They met in basements and at block parties through mutual friends and borrowed microphones. When DJ Alamo came into the mix, cutting and scratching behind them, the chemistry was instant. Together, they found their rhythm, and soon after, their mission.
Every song, there's some witty wordplay going on.
Brand Nubian's foundation was steeped in the 5% nation of gods and earths, a movement that saw the black man as divine, the original builder of civilization. In their view, the black man was God, the black woman was earth, and the rest of the world, the 85%, was lost in ignorance. It was a radical idea dressed in hip-hop swagger, and it gave Brand Nubian their edge. They weren't just rappers. They saw themselves as teachers. Every verse was a lesson. Every show was a sermon. Mind you, this was the late 80s, the tail end of the golden age of hip-hop. Public Enemy had already turned rap into protest music. KRS-One was teaching history over beats. Rakim had turned flow into philosophy. The streets were full of messages, but few groups managed to walk the tightrope between street and sermon the way Brand Nubian did. When Elektra Records signed them, it wasn't just another rap act added to the roster. The label knew they were dealing with something explosive, and when One For All dropped in 1990, the explosion hit hard. Critics called it one of the most intelligent, unapologetic records of the era. The Source gave it 5 mics, the magazine's highest honor, and fans hailed it as a revolution wrapped in rhythm. But inside the message, there was tension. One For All was raw, pro-black, and militant. It didn't pull punches. Songs like Drop the Bomb were confrontational, while Wake Up pushed the edge so far that MTV banned the original video. The image of a black man in whiteface was too much for the mainstream to digest. Naturally, the label panicked. But on the streets, that ban only amplified their voice. You couldn't turn on a mixtape or walk into a Harlem record shop without hearing "Wake Up." Kids memorized the lyrics like scripture, and elders debated the message. But Brand Nubian's message wasn't for everyone. Some saw them as prophets. Others saw them as extremists. Their unapologetic pride made corporate radio nervous. Some Jewish and white advocacy groups accused the group of promoting hate, misinterpreting the 5% lessons as anti-Semitic or racist. But to the group, it wasn't hate, it was truth, their truth. Inside the group though, things were starting to unravel. Grand Puba, the most polished of the three, was growing restless. He'd been the star since his Masters of Ceremony days. In interviews, he smiled through it, but behind the scenes, he didn't like sharing the spotlight. Studio sessions turned tense. Money went missing. There were rumors of Puba showing up early, taking food stipends meant for everyone, and leaving before the others arrived.
He knew there'd be per diem at the studio. He would come early and swipe all the food money and do his verse and break out.
This dude was coming at 2 o'clock, taking the money and leaving. When our session was at 5.
Yo, look, whoever got there first got the money.
It became a race to the studio to see who could get there first to get it.
And Puba was also working with other artists. His flow was smooth, confident, and unmistakably cool. When Mary J. Blige needed someone to lace her breakout single, What's the 411, with a touch of swagger, she called Puba. When A Tribe Called Quest was putting together Low End Theory, there he was, vibing like he belonged in every circle that mattered. He even worked with Heavy D, who was as mainstream as hip-hop could get at the time.
I won't curse. I'll take a famous curse word and just say coof.
Everywhere he went, people said the same thing, Puba's next. And they weren't wrong. Inside Brand Nubian though, things were getting even more tense. Lord Jamar was deep into the teachings of the 5% Nation and wanted the group to double down on the message. Heavier on the knowledge, less on the party. Sadat X wanted balance, something that still hit the block but had meaning. Puba, though, wanted to breathe. He wanted to make records that felt slick, that could sit next to a Tribe or a Heavy D joint and still knock. It wasn't just philosophy, it was ego too. So studio sessions started getting uncomfortable. Jokes turned into arguments. Arguments turned into silence. There were rumors of missed shows, money disputes, and long stretches where Puba recorded separately from the others.
At some point, he just stopped coming, period. We gotta go out to the crowd who's like, where's Puba? Where's Puba? Where's Puba? Where's Puba?
I remember we went somewhere where he didn't come with dude didn't want to pay us. You know what I'm saying? And it was hard to do the shows like that.
Even their DJ Alamo, who had always been Puba's right hand, started feeling caught in the middle. Alamo later said it wasn't just about creative direction, it was about recognition. Everyone felt like they were contributing, but only one man was getting the spotlight.
Well, that was when the fork in the road was for Brand Nubian. You know what I mean? And Sincere is family. Love my brother. You know what I mean?
By that time, the tension was impossible to hide. Interviews became awkward, group appearances grew rare, and in a genre where momentum was everything, Brand Nubian's chemistry was cracking fast. So when Puba left in 1991, it wasn't a surprise. He didn't make a big announcement, he just walked away. DJ Alamo went with him. They quietly began working on what would become Reel to Reel, his solo debut. For the remaining members, Lord Jamar and Sadat X, it felt like the center had just been ripped out. And in many ways, that's exactly what happened. Their next phase was darker and sharper. Without Puba's humor and balance, the sound shifted towards something more militant. Their rhymes hit harder, their tone more confrontational. They weren't just rapping about enlightenment anymore. They were pushing back at a world that seemed determined to silence them. When their new album, In God We Trust, dropped, it sounded like a warning.
Black youth were sent you from the hard urban blocks and now rule residential at the guard.
There was a clear hostility toward the music industry, a sense that hip-hop had sold its soul to radio trends and corporate polish. Their rhymes carried resentment against fake rappers, weak DJs, and anyone who they thought had turned hip-hop into a playground for opportunists. The tension wasn't just in the lyrics, it was in their eyes during interviews. They carried themselves like soldiers who'd seen betrayal. Every line felt coded, like a declaration that Brand Nubian wasn't here to entertain anymore. They were here to warn. The single that set it all off, Punks Jump Up to Get Beat Down, was a middle finger to anyone doubting they could survive without Puba. But it also became the moment that defined the group's darker era for all the wrong reasons. The beat was raw, the delivery vicious, but the song crossed a line that would follow them forever. Sadat X dropped a line that became infamous. I don't understand their ways. I ain't down with gays. It was a moment that split hip-hop in half, between those who saw it as real talk and those who saw it as hate speech. At the time, hip-hop wasn't having open conversations about sexuality. The culture still prized hypermasculinity and street toughness. But Brand Nubian's rhetoric, rooted in parts of 5% theology that viewed sexuality as unnatural, made their stance more ideological than impulsive. Still, the backlash was immediate. Critics called it hypocrisy, that the same group teaching black pride was now spreading intolerance. The group tried to walk it back later, censoring the lyric on reissues, but the damage was done. Even worse, their anger was no longer confined to the booth. Violence was becoming part of their image. Rumors spread fast across New York radio that Brand Nubian's crew had started pressuring DJs who refused to spin their records. Some DJs claimed they were intimidated, followed, or even cornered at shows.
You stand or you fall. And we decided we was gonna stand.
Whether it was true or not, the image stuck. The message of empowerment was bleeding into aggression. The idea of black strength was now being projected through fear. And in an era when rap beefs could turn fatal overnight, no one wanted to test them. Then during a show in Los Angeles, the group's frustration with a sound man over technical issues spiraled into chaos. DJ Sincere got into it with a sound engineer over faulty equipment. Words turned to shouting, and before anyone knew it, fists were flying. But what made this different from a backstage scuffle was who was in the room. The group's entourage included affiliates from Jordan Downs, one of LA's toughest housing projects. Within seconds, nearly 50 men surrounded the stage.
Sincere was DJing for us at the time. I remember also being there with a bunch of my dudes from the Jordan Downs.
The sound man didn't stand a chance. He was beaten badly, dragged into chaos that had nothing to do with him. Jamal himself would later recall injuring his leg while jumping off the stage to join the fight. When the dust settled, gunfire echoed outside the venue. Nobody died, but the story spread fast. That night became a symbol of how quickly righteous anger could rot into something else. To many, Brand Nubian had crossed the line between consciousness and chaos. Yet, the streets loved them even more for it, because they weren't just talking about revolution anymore, they were living it. They were unpredictable, militant, and in their own way, fearless. And that anger carried into their next project, Everything is Everything, where the violence wasn't just metaphorical anymore. Songs like Lick Dem remix felt like they were written in the heat of a street war. The criminal imagery, the paranoia, it was all there.
They like fire knife or a gun, so when you see me coming, you run.
The commercial success was modest, but by then, that wasn't the point. Brand Nubian wasn't chasing charts. They were fighting for relevance, yet the cost of that fight was high. Critics began calling their music hate with a beat. Their shows drew controversy more than crowds. And by 1995, it was over again. Another breakup, another pause in a career defined by both brilliance and self-destruction. When Brand Nubian's energy began to splinter, Lord Jamar didn't fade into the background. He just got louder, more defined, more dangerous. The same man who once stood for divine knowledge now carried the aura of someone who'd seen too much of both heaven and hell. Born Lorenzo de Chalas, Jamar grew up in New Rochelle, a quiet suburb just outside New York City. 2 parents, steady home, clean streets, but that normalcy didn't sit right with him. To Jamar, comfort felt like weakness. He wanted the validation that came from surviving danger. So, as a teenager, he started leaving the suburbs to hang in the hood areas, chasing the edge that his environment didn't provide. By age 13, that search for authenticity took him into something far darker. A janitor in his building introduced him to the crack trade, and the kid who should have been playing ball after school was instead learning how to cut, bag, and flip. Jamar didn't just sell it, he used it. At 13, the dealer became his own customer. He would later admit that some of the early Brand Nubian demo sessions were funded directly from drug money. The transportation, the food, the hustle that kept the dream alive all came from that same world he knew he had to escape. But escape wasn't easy. His teenage years were a blur of paranoia and survival. Sealed indictments started dropping on people he knew, entire crews getting swept up in overnight raids. He narrowly dodged that fate. What finally broke the cycle wasn't prison, it was fear. One night, after an intense binge, Jamar said he genuinely believed he was dying. That moment, more than any police threat, scared him straight. He credited his 5% nation beliefs, the idea that man is God and must master himself, as what pulled him out of addiction. But even after he left the streets, that survival mindset never left him. And that mindset started bleeding into his image. The guns, the anger, the readiness to confront all became part of the brand. In 2000, that aggression turned literal. Jamal was arrested for slapping his wife, and when police searched his home, they found an unlicensed firearm and 2 bulletproof vests. The irony was sharp. A man known for teaching knowledge of self was living like he expected war. Charged with assault and weapons possession, Jamar's private life began to look more like the street stories he once rapped against. That same year, HBO came calling. In Oz, he played Supreme Allah, a 5%er inmate who preached wisdom while running drugs behind bars. It was typecasting, and it worked. The character was Jamar's contradictions made flesh: intelligent, militant, and terrifyingly unpredictable. Art imitated life, and for once, he didn't have to act. But as the decades moved on, Lord Jamar traded rhyme books for microphones, not to rap, but to debate. Through interviews and podcasts, especially his appearances on Vlad TV, he transformed into one of hip-hop's most polarizing commentators. His message was consistent. Hip-hop was built by black people, for black people, and everyone else was just renting space. His most infamous quote summed it up perfectly. White rappers are guests in the house of hip-hop. For some, he was defending the culture. For others, he was dividing it. The spark became a fire in 2013 when he aimed that message at white rappers like Yelawolf. Yelawolf fired back, telling him to shut the fuck up. Jamar didn't laugh it off. He threatened him, flat out. Said if they ever crossed paths, it was on sight. Not metaphorical, not symbolic, physical. That same instinct that once had him selling crack at 13 now had him promising violence at 45.
But nobody backed out. They didn't have the money, you bozo. The are you talking about?
Then, in 2018, Eminem dissed Jamar on the track Fall, a clear response to years of Jamar questioning his legitimacy. Jamar claimed the line, "Go fetch me the remote," was racially loaded. A white rapper commanding a black man. The internet exploded. To one side, Jamar was right. Hip-hop did start in black neighborhoods, and cultural appropriation had always been an issue. But to others, Jamar's argument felt stuck in the past, like a man guarding a gate that had already been broken down. Eminem didn't need to say much else. His success spoke louder than any lyric. 80 million albums, global stages, critical respect from legends, including those Jamar claimed he didn't belong beside. And even Eminem's close ally, Royce da 5'9", weighed in. Royce said, "I understand where Jamar's coming from, but there's a way to say it without closing the door on people." Charlemagne the God echoed that sentiment, calling Jamar right in theory, wrong in delivery.
Me and him, we just disagreed on that. That was it, and then they kept talking about it on Vlad.
Hip-hop historians took it further. They pointed out that Jamar's 5% ideology, with its belief in black supremacy and divine knowledge, came from a time when the community needed pride as protection. But in the 2020s, that same rhetoric sounded more like exclusion than empowerment. It alienated younger fans who saw hip-hop as global, not tribal. Still, Jamar's confidence never cracked. He saw himself as a truth teller, the man saying what others were too scared to say. His live streams became sermons, raw, unfiltered, sometimes absurd. When b-boy pioneer Crazy Legs challenged him to a celebrity boxing match, Jamar went on camera calling him a bozo and a bum, threatening to put him through pain every damn round. The crowd laughed, but the energy was familiar. It was the same fire that once powered Brand Nubian in their militant prime, only now it burned alone. By then, even his old school peers started mocking him. 50 Cent clowned him online, calling him Lord Jerome, and asking if he smoked a bad batch. It was cruel, but it reflected a harsh truth. Lord Jamar had become more famous for his opinions than his music. And as much as Jamal lived in controversies, Sadat X, his partner, also lived two lives that were never meant to coexist. In one, he was Derek Murphy, a school teacher, firefighter, and basketball coach from New Rochelle, the kind of man parents trusted with their kids. In the other, he was Sadat X, the wild cowboy, a voice of militant consciousness from Brand Nubian, sharp-tongued, street-bred, and restless. The problem was, Those two versions of him never truly made peace. One fought to uplift the next generation. The other was still haunted by the instincts of a man raised in a culture that prized survival above composure. By the mid-2000s, Sadat X was something rare in hip-hop, a man with a job that didn't involve a stage. Between studio sessions, he'd show up in classrooms, teaching 6th graders to read and write. When he wasn't recording or touring, he was coaching basketball or working shifts as a qualified firefighter.
Being in the city, I had played basketball, so, you know, I was a little name in basketball. But now dudes were seeing me like, yo, I seen the video. Is that you rapping? Like, you rap? I was like, yeah, man, you know. It was real. It was crazy to see because back then, everybody couldn't get a deal. You had to be nice.
It wasn't an act. He genuinely believed in service. That balance, though, between righteousness and rebellion was fragile, and on a cold night in Harlem, it shattered. It was December 22nd, 2005. Sadat X was on 158th and Broadway, an area that had seen better days. Something went down. The details vary, but the consensus is that it started small, with a few words exchanged, a look, and a perceived slight. But then the teacher, the firefighter, the man who once rapped about knowledge of self, reached for something that didn't belong in any of those worlds, a loaded .40 caliber Beretta.
I know Sadat X got caught with a gun at one point. Number one, what was the reason why Sadat was carrying a gun?
You probably have to ask him.
Witnesses said he flashed it at a group of teenagers and shouted, "I'm going to kill everybody," while searching for a man with braids. It was reckless, unfiltered, and deeply human, the kind of moment where instinct overrode identity. When the cops showed up, the scene was chaos. The teens pointed across the street. That's him, Sadat X. Gun still visible, tried to run. It didn't work. He was tackled, cuffed, and charged with criminal possession of a weapon, reckless endangerment, and resisting arrest. For someone who had spent years telling kids to stay out of trouble, the irony was brutal. The fallout hit hard. Teachers don't survive felony arrests. Neither do public servants. Overnight, Derek Murphy lost everything that tied him to respectability: the classroom, the badge, the moral high ground. What remained was Sadat X, the man who had to face himself. His sentence included time at Rikers Island. Lord Jamar, who had seen his friends rise and fall up close, would later describe it simply, "He got caught with it." Did a year for that. There was no glorification in his tone, just resignation. Like it was one more story from an era where rappers carried guns for protection, even when they knew better.
I think he might have felt like he had a lightweight beef or something in the neighborhood at that time, and he just was having it on him, like, you know what I mean?
Inside, Sadat X turned the experience into reflection. He wrote, recorded, and released Black October, a record steeped in regret, fatigue, and brutal honesty. The album didn't celebrate violence or justify it. Instead, it sounded like someone talking to himself in a dark room, trying to understand why he let the old habits win. On the closing track, Momentary Outro, he detailed the night of his arrest with chilling realism, not as a gangster's tale, but as a cautionary one. You could feel the weight of it. A man who'd once been a teacher, now speaking from behind a cell door, trying to teach again, only this time through confession. It wasn't the first time his art had predicted his reality. Back in 2000, he dropped an EP titled The State of New York vs. Derek Murphy. 5 years later, that title became prophecy. He had spent his career rapping about justice and survival, but now, those two ideas had collided. What made the story even more tragic was how unnecessary it all seemed. People close to him said there wasn't a real beef that night. No rival, no setup, just paranoia. A reflexive fear born from living too long with the tension between who he was and who the world expected him to be. When he got out, Sadat X didn't fade away. He picked up where he left off, recording, touring, teaching when he could, still carrying the aura of a man who'd lived both the sermon and the sin. But something had changed. His later music felt calmer, humbler. The aggression was still there, but now it carried a sense of consequence. He was still the same man who'd taught 6th graders to stay away from the streets, only now, he had a story they'd listen to. So you see, the story of Brand Nubian is complicated because their power came from two things that rarely mix cleanly: truth and threat. Listen to a lot of conscious rap after 1990, and you'll hear Brand Nubian's fingerprints. Dead Prez borrowed the militant cadence and the insistence on political education. Immortal Technique used the same moral outrage, with less 5% vocabulary but equal moral rigor. Kanye West's earliest work traded in an intellectual honesty about race and class that echoed the way Brand Nubian folded pride into pop structure. That doesn't mean Kanye or Dead Prez copied them line for line. It means Brand Nubian helped open the room, showing how pride, scripture, and street stories could cohabitate in a hit record. Artists felt safer saying bigger things because Brand Nubian had already said them out loud. Their 5%er theology demands strict codes, and parts of that doctrine, particularly around gender and sexuality, fed ugly language that critics rightly condemned. At the same time, their insistence on knowledge inspired Black intellectual currents in hip-hop that still matter. Brand Nubian's influence lives on because music outlasts blame. Their production choices, their cadence, their use of doctrine and street anecdote taught generations how to make a record that mattered. In the end, the streets don't forget, because they remember both the sermons and the scars. The group's music taught knowledge of self, the streets taught knowledge of consequence, and both are part of the same hard lesson.